In today's lesson, we're going to dive into a very popular way of learning the fretboard known as the CAGED system. First, I'll explain what the CAGED system is the way I was taught, and then I'll show you how I use this system in my own playing and why I think it's a really useful tool. We'll also discuss a few holes in this system and things we can use to fill in the gaps so you have a really complete set of fundamentals for learning the fretboard. My name is Jack Ruch. Welcome to my channel. Let's get into it. Let's talk about the 5 basic chord inversions that are the foundation of the CAGED system. Now, CAGED is an acronym that stands for the C chord, the A chord, the G chord, the E chord, and the D chord. These are your basic major open position chords on the guitar. Now, it's really common to take an E chord and move it up the neck and make a bar chord out of it by barring behind the chord. We can also do this with the A chord and make an A bar chord. But we don't have to stop there. We can do this with any of these 5 chord shapes. For instance, we can take a C chord and move it up 2 whole steps and bar behind it and get a nice voicing for an E major chord. The only thing we have to do is bar behind the chord to account for any open strings we have down in our open position chords. So for instance, we could take a G major chord and move that up, bar behind it, and there's a C major chord. We can take a D chord, move that up, and there's a voicing for an A major chord using the D shape. So what's really cool about these CAGED shapes is the way they lay out across the fretboard and the way each chord shares common notes with the next chord to connect the dots across the fretboard. All right, so here is the C chord laid out across the neck using these CAGED shapes. First, we have the open position C. Then that connects to our A shape, right? The root here on the 3rd fret of the A string connects these 2 shapes together. Then that connects next up to our G shape, right? These 3 notes on the 5th fret of the D string, G string, and B string from our A shape connect right here to our G shape. Then the root C on the low E string and the high E string of this G shape connect us to our E bar chord shape. And then this root right here on the 10th fret of the D string connects us to our D shape, which you can also play with the 3rd and the bass. I like that voicing. So these are our CAGED position shapes connected up the fretboard. Now, these chord shapes on their own aren't necessarily that useful because some of these shapes are a bit clunky and difficult to play. But what it does give you is 5 clearly defined positions that you can use to map things out on the fretboard. And this is incredibly useful for mapping out scales or arpeggios. You can use these 5 positions to map out virtually any scale or arpeggio to any type of chord. And it's really going to help you eliminate any dead spots on the fretboard where you might get lost or might not know exactly what to play to connect certain parts of the fretboard together. All right, so here's an example of what I'm talking about using these 5 CAGED positions as a jumping off point for playing scales and arpeggios. So first we'll start by just playing through the 5 positions of a C major scale. So the C major scale based around this open C shape would be this. And then moving up to our A bar chord, we get this. And G shape, we get this. And then up to our E bar chord, we have this scale. And then finally, our D shape, we get this scale pattern. Alright, so now let's do it with an arpeggio. We'll take a C dominant 7 arpeggio and use these same 5 positions to map that out. So if we play down here, we would get this. And then moving up to our A bar chord, we get. And then moving up to our G bar chord. And then moving up to our E bar chord, we get this. And then finally our D bar chord. So you can see how this is a really useful tool for mapping things out everywhere and eliminating any gaps or dead spots in the fretboard that could be a hang up for connecting different positions across the neck. So the thing that I personally find that's so useful about this CAGED system is when we start applying it to playing over chord progressions. We can take these 5 positions and use these CAGED shapes to map out all the different chords in our progression, and then we can play over them without having to jump around the fretboard because we'll know where all the chords are in every position on the guitar. So for instance, I can take something like C major to G major to A minor to F major, and I can map that out in each of these 5 positions using these CAGED shapes. And then if I know the arpeggios to these chords and the scales that fit over these chords, I can play over them in each position and use the chords as a guide to visualize things across the fretboard. All right, so here I'll play through our progression of C major to G major to A minor to F major in all 5 positions, starting down in this open position, and just cycling between these 4 chords, but using our CAGED shapes to play the chord progression in each of the 5 positions. Alright, so now using these chord shapes as a guide, I'll play some single note melodies moving through each chord progression that target chord tones from each one of the chords. So this method of using these caged position chords and their corresponding arpeggios to play over chord progressions is something I use for everything. Even more complex jazz style chord progressions, I'll use this exact same method of finding the chords in each position and using the arpeggios to those chord shapes to make melodic lines that outline the changes. But when it comes to playing rhythm guitar and chordal stuff, I tend to lean more towards triads and triad groupings. This is something that I find a little bit more useful than these caged position chord shapes. Now the triad groupings overlap with the caged position chords, but what it gives you is specifically the root, third, and fifth of each chord laid out in much smaller, more practical shapes across the fretboard that I find more useful. And when it comes to playing over more complex chords, you can use the upper extension triads of those chords to cover things like sevenths and ninths. All right, so now I'll play through these C major triad groupings, and this is going to break down the fretboard into 3 positions, but they overlap with the 5 caged shapes, right? So our first set of triad groupings starts down here in the open position, right? And that covers part of our D shape and part of our open C shape. And then as we move up to the next set of groupings, we get this, right, which covers part of our A shape and part of our G shape. And then finally we get this third position, right, which covers our E shape and the bottom part of our D shape. And of course, once we move this open position shape up the octave, we get that D shape covered again up there. Right, so this is really useful for playing rhythm guitar parts. These triad shapes are much easier to manage, much more practical ways of playing through chords. And again, if we apply it to our chord progression, you know, we come up with some really nice little digestible, easy to play little bits we can use for rhythm guitar parts, right? Okay, so this cage system is a really useful tool for mapping things out on the fretboard. And I really encourage you to explore all 5 of these positions if you haven't already. I'm sure you'll find some new and interesting ways of connecting the dots on the fretboard. As always, I want to thank you for watching. Check the links down in the description for my different courses, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, happy practicing, and I will catch you next time. Take care.